Just appreciating that we can gather like this. And one of the, I think, obvious truths, we always want to be careful when we're claiming a truth, but it seems obvious to me at least, this truth that what I need, what the world needs is calm and serenity. And, when the nervous system is agitated and upset, we're not our best self, just in terms of navigating life and all the things we've got to do and all the people we have to interact with. But when the body, heart, mind, the nervous system is settled, stable, then actually we have the capacity to be intimate, to be responsive, to do what needs to be done, to tolerate what's difficult and unpleasant, to not be intoxicated by what's pleasant, because we're already feeling good, when we're settled. So then we're not going to sell our soul when some pleasant experience is on the horizon, because we're already feeling good. And if we can have ice cream with that good feeling, fine. But if there isn't ice cream or some other nice experience, we're also okay. So I just say that as a beginning to settling in now for a meditation time. In these last couple of weeks, and maybe for a couple more weeks, I've been emphasizing calm, what in Buddhism we call samatha practice, just this in our heart, valuing, like being okay about really valuing and appreciating calm and the good feeling of calm or serenity. You could even call it an embodied well-being. And that actually, in a way, it's a birthright, but we tend, just partly because of the culture, time, whatever, we tend not to respect it, not to value it. I mean, intellectually, I think we all value it, being settled, being calm, being serene. But if we actually looked at our choices that we make throughout the day, well, our choices might not actually line up with that value. And the proximate cause for serenity, for that inner calm, that embodied well-being, the proximate cause is the continuity of present moment awareness. So do what you can to find a sitting posture that works for you. Some combination of the body being settled and relaxed, but also the body expressing this interest in being bright and alert. So sitting up in a way that supports that alertness, but without compromising this intention to be at ease and relaxed. See what that might look like, feel like for you today with your body. We just do the best we can, and doing the best we can to hold the body relatively still. Eyes can be open or closed. And taking the time to remember, to recognize what it is to be present and what it is to be distracted or lost in thought. So initially, what we're emphasizing in our meditation time is to sustain present moment awareness, Don't ask the mind to do anything more than remembering to recognize the present moment. And you'll find very quickly this is something that has to be renewed moment by moment by moment, this not forgetting the present moment, keeping the present moment in mind. And we learn a lot about what that energy of persistence means, this not forgetting the present moment. And it's easy both to not make enough effort, but it's also very easy to make the wrong kind of effort, to try too hard in a way that doesn't help. What is the effort needed now for each of us? What is the effort needed to remember to recognize present moment, that this is being known? And we're willing to begin again and again. Don't worry about thoughts. When we remember to recognize the present moment, we might recognize, oh, thinking is being known. Or we're remembering to recognize what is being known, that it's being known, this moment. And you'll discover there are thoughts that actually support the continuity of present moment awareness, and there are thoughts that distract, that create a little bubble in which the mind gets lost or forgetful. So we're renouncing distractedness. We want to be respectful of that force of habit to get lost in thought, to be distracted. So therefore, we're willing to begin again and again, and to begin to learn how the mind takes the bait and, in a sense, and goes down that pathway toward distractedness, being lost in thought. Remember, I haven't asked you to focus on any particular meditation object. We're just sitting relatively still, and we're persisting at remembering to recognize the present moment and trying to discover what is the particular wise effort that allows for this continuity, this sustained present moment awareness. Don't be fooled by thoughts of doubt, like, am I doing it right? That's just a thought being known in the present moment. So we can have many skillful and unskillful thoughts, and still there can be an awareness that this is being known. This is just something arising and passing in the present moment. And if and when you feel like you want to add some more depth to your samadhi, your concentration practice, then you can experiment with the instructions, sustained, silent, present moment awareness. So it's not about being anti-thought, trying to get rid of thoughts, as much as it is about appreciating the silence between thoughts, keeping the silence almost like a space, a silent space This is part of the nature of the mind, the sense of silence, stillness, space, in which the activity of thought and the activity of hearing, the activity of feeling sensation happens. We're learning to keep that silence, that silent space in mind. In a sense, it becomes the meditation object as best we can. Obviously, it's subtle. We just do the best we can, let that be good enough. Sustained, silent, present moment awareness. And because the mind is interested in the silence, naturally thoughts will fall into the background or the periphery of the mind. Us doing our best to keep the silent space of the present moment in mind. It's all about learning to be interested in what's subtle and allowing everything else just to happen on its own, whatever that might be. And just noticing what happens when there is some sustained, silent, present moment awareness. Notice the effect on the body and mind. So with the second instruction, we're renouncing the mind's attachment to mental activity, to thought. There still may be thought, but just letting it be in the background. Now, the third instruction, sustained, silent, focused attention or present moment awareness. We use a primary meditation object, an anchor, and we practice renouncing the mind's allegiance to all the diversity of our present moment experience. Sounds will be heard, of course. Sensations will be felt. Thoughts will be noticed. But we're keeping the primary meditation object in mind. Many of us use that ordinary sensation of breathing in and breathing out, feeling that maybe at the nostrils or feeling it as a rising and falling of the abdominal wall. But it can be any meditation object. Hearing can work. Feeling the whole body together can be an anchor, primary meditation object. If you feel like it, experiment inviting the mind to be interested in a very specific meditation object, like at the tip of the nostrils, and feeling that ordinary touching as the breath goes in and out. So it's an exclusive kind of interest. Realizing that the mind can drop its interest in the other phenomena that are coming and going. We're making the effort of being interested in the meditation object. It's a very refined kind of effort. Doesn't make the body tight. Can we train the mind to be authentically interested in what is essentially so ordinary, like feeling the sensations of breathing in and out? It might seem like a real act of courage to cultivate for a period of time this exclusive attention to the meditation object and to let go of everything else. Notice the effect of that. And now for the last minute or so, you might want to open the eyes, but sitting relatively still, simply notice any effects from the training we did this last 30 minutes. Notice if there's any sense of calm. Any sense of the body and mind feeling settled. Sense of wholeness or fullness. So take a little time, stretch, move your body a little if you want. Even if you want to stand for a minute or two or a moment or two to release any tension that might have built up. For those online, I put a document in the chat there that has links to some things that might be of interest to you, including my notes, some of my notes for the talk today, also last week, and people on here in the room. You can get that same document by going to the calendar, public calendar online, and just look for the Google Doc link there in the calendar event. So as I mentioned, we've been working with concentration now for a couple of weeks, and really realizing that what we call in Buddhism Samadhi, this stability or gathering, unification maybe of the mind, of the heart. Remember, heart, mind, we use the word as chitta. And this coming together, and it has a real visceral sense. I mean, we know, if we care to look, we know when the mind, heart seems really discombobulated, wired, dissipated, scattered, right? We know that experience, how that is. Do we know the opposite? We probably do, but we actually want to make a real art and science of knowing that spectrum from distractedness, fragmented, superficial, to unified, stable, collected, gathered, grounded, still, empty of what's agitating, right? Now the way I mentioned this last week, the way we generally get familiar with that spectrum from distractedness to non-distractedness is based on our environment. Like some environments to us are really agitating. Oh, okay. And then some environments, alone in our bedroom, covered, snuggled, peaceful. And the mind is, not always, right? We can be frenetic in our bedrooms too. But you get the general idea that how our mind is somewhat affected by the environment that we're in the middle of. But what we're learning is that there's a lot we can do to take care of our mind. We can actually develop skill. And however our mind is, we can develop more and more skill. So if you tend to be someone who is restless and agitated and superficial, with a mind that's all over the place, unsettled, like the wind, as it says in one of the, I think maybe in the Dhammapada, there's something I read last week, that the mind is like the wind. It alights here, it alights there, it just jumps around. And whoever we are, whatever kind of temperament, personality we have, we can train our mind. And that's part of our meditation. It's not the whole deal with our daily sitting practice. And generally over time, it's much more about developing wisdom than it is about training the mind to settle. But one of the things the Buddha says, and that we all learn very quickly, is a settled mind, a settled heart, naturally sees things more clearly. So the deepening of wisdom is a natural result of having a settled heart, body, mind. Just the opposite is also true. A mind, heart, body that's not settled, we tend to be driven by habits. We don't learn much. And you know how it is. Sometimes, our life has been really difficult or crazy and this and that, and then there's a kind of a little reprieve, and we look back and we realize that, I've just been on autopilot. I've just been trying to stay above the water, not drown, There hasn't been any deep learning. Mostly when we look back at those periods of time, mostly what we sense is how a lot of the habit energies that got me through those last few weeks were not really the habits I want to be reinforcing. They kind of work, but it wasn't pretty, how I got myself through. Like one example would be, it's like the mind is tired, it doesn't want to do it, whatever's next, and you basically bribe it. Well, if you do what's next, you can have this, we'll go drinking with my friend, or we'll do this, or we'll do that. And the thing about a unified mind, a mind that's concentrated or settled, it just naturally has a lot of integrity. Like it's hard to act out ethically when the mind is really settled. And it's relatively easy for us to do things that harm ourselves and others when our mind is unsettled. It's just easier to justify even things we know we shouldn't be doing. It's just easy to justify when our mind isn't settled. And it's harder to justify unethical acts, even, unskillful thoughts, when the mind is really settled. They stand out. Because a settled heart, a settled mind, this word purity, I know it can push our buttons a little bit. But in Buddhism, purity, a moral integrity, is something internal. It isn't something imposed on us by some outside force, like the person in charge. It's like our own sense of integrity is something that has real purity, real beauty, real trustworthiness. And then anything that, in a sense, goes against that integrity, around non-harming, around living ethically, it just stands out against that integrity. We just know, like I'm sure you felt in moments, oh, I'm not so sure about what I'm inclined to say here. Maybe, and that's where that wholesome restraint comes from. I mean, if we didn't have that moral force of wholesome restraint, we'd all be in trouble, right? So it's already, to some degree, operating in all of us, moral restraint. But it really depends on that sensitivity. And the point I want to make here is that there's really no end to this power of gathering, unifying the mind and heart. And we want to see it as the ground of all competence. Whatever we want to be competent in, approaching that or engaging that with a settled, gathered, collected, relaxed, stable mind is the best way forward. Whatever we want to do, knit, or cook dinner, or make love, or run a corporation, or whatever it is. It just helps. And a lot of people who are successful, like if, the success that comes not because of good fortune, or you're the child of somebody who had a lot of power or whatever, a lot of what makes people successful in the world is that they have developed, or they just naturally had, this capacity to be settled. Because then the mind sees clearly, it sees the options, it sees cause and effect. It sees how things happen. That's what a stable, clear mind sees. It sees the nature of things, or what we in Buddhism call Dhamma or Dharma, the way it is. It's a lawful, we live in a lawful universe. It's complex, for sure. But we can intuit, not always that clearly, but we can, when the mind is really stable and clear, we have some intuition about how, not like the whole picture, okay, what I'm going to do today, what I'm going to do tomorrow, what I'm going to do 2 weeks and 2 months down the road. But we do have some intuition about what's appropriate in this moment when the heart's settled. It's kind of a basic truism, that if I have a lot of lack of clarity, a lot of uncertainty about what I should do next, the thing to do is to relax and gather the mind. The thing that isn't helpful is to endlessly spin as if I can figure it out by thinking about it. So often, I've developed this habit over the decades, practicing now for over 40 years. But when I am having one of those moments in the middle of a busy day, and I'm starting to snowball and it seems like too much, I'll go lie down in one of my Samadhi poses, right? So there's the typical, the stereotypical Samadhi pose, which is, we see the statues and people sitting, whether you're on a chair or on a cushion. But lying down flat on your back, maybe with a little pillow on the back of the head so the spine's in alignment. Some people have their calves on a chair, knees at a right angle. But basically, in a more relaxed position can also be a Samadhi pose. And I feel what it feels like, especially in the middle of the day. It feels good to be lying down. And my mind concentrates on that good feeling, the pleasant feeling of resting. And because it's interested in that experience, especially in the first few minutes, it's a very engaging object for present moment awareness to be aware of. So it's relatively easy for the mind to unhook from all the other juicy reactive stuff that might be bouncing around there, and to keep the present moment in mind by being aware of what it feels like to be lying down. And by having that more exclusive attention on the experience of lying there, resting, well, then the mind drops everything else. To the degree the mind is aware of that, it's not aware of whatever else. What am I going to do? What should I say to that person? How can I make amends? What is that person up to? We can drop it. Really drop it. And to realize, we can even realize in a moment, this is the mind that isn't holding all of that. We can notice the mind that is not entangled with the dramas of our life. This is the heart, this is the mind, not entangled. Empty of that entanglement, those entanglements. And then if the mind were to pick up an entanglement, having rested, having unified around the present moment, then it's going to engage it in a fresh way. One of the reasons, doubting is a hindrance, this is a kind of unproductive doubt, is that there's nothing fresh about it. There's some image of something going on in our life that arises in the mind, and the mind freaks out, and it thinks about that problem in a particular way that makes it freak out, and then it does it again. And it might sort of look at the problem in different angles, but the basic structure of I'm screwed here, whatever the kind of basic presumption is, just gets repeated. And then tension makes the mind want to look at it again, and it does, and it reacts. So there's nothing productive, there's nothing new. The mind keeps seeing what it expects to see, and it reacts in the way that it's conditioned to react, and over again. And that's that unproductive spinning, which we do so much. I mean, generally we do this just reading the news, whatever kind of news you tend to watch or read. We read it, or we look at it, and we react, and we look at it, and it just sort of feeds the same basic presumptions that we have. Whatever, each of us will have our own particular version, we're going down the drain here, or, we're moving into the next great blossoming of humanity, or whatever your idea is, but it becomes some kind of drama for the mind. And it's more about the recreation of the drama than it is about the mind navigating skillfully the next moment, which is really what life is about. Life isn't about having some grand idea that's about the way the world is. It's not going to put food on the table. It's not going to help you get along with your partner, or, know whether you should put your dog down or not, or all these other things we navigate in life. Having some, philosophy of life. It's really about, the philosophy of life from a Buddhist perspective is understanding how valuable it is to be intimate, to be really connecting moment by moment. And it's never enough to say, well, I was connected. I had 15 moments in a row where I was really connected. So that was probably good for those 15 moments. But it's like the only thing that's of real value is a lifestyle, meaning like always. So we're training the mind for a way of being, a way of relating that we want in an ongoing way, a never-ending way. And we want to imagine that there's no end to this. The Buddha considers like the potential of a concentrated mind. He names it as one of the 4 imponderables. One of the 4 things you shouldn't actually try to figure out. You should develop concentration, but you shouldn't get involved with, speculating with your friends. Like, what can you do with a concentrated mind? Because the Buddha said there's really no end. The other 3, by just for you Buddhist nerds out there. So, understanding the nature of a awakened mind is an imponderable. Understanding the nature of a concentrated mind, as I mentioned. Needing to understand the intricacies of karma, like how it has come to be. That will just drive you crazy, right? Because we don't need to know that, and we can't actually know it. It's too complex and subtle. And the last is the origin of the universe, Which is like, this is late at night when you smoke too much pot or drunk too much alcohol with a good friend, you start, it seems relevant to sort of like, how did this all begin? And it seems relevant, like even now, like, how did it? Right? But it's like, you see how it sort of takes us into this abstract realm, like mathematics or something, that doesn't really have to do with this moment, having a mind and body in relationship with everybody else in this moment. And how it is that suffering or stress arises and how it is that stress ceases. A lot of these things we go into, these sort of more philosophical things, it can be, it's not always this way, but it can be a way to just not want to feel, not want to connect with what's here and now. Or life. It's also that great scene in Annie Hall where Woody Allen, one of the characters in the film, is pacing back and forth, speculating about JFK and who killed him, President Kennedy, and how that all happened. And his maybe wife, I forget, Annie Hall, if she's his wife or partner, says to him, I think you just, was something like, you don't want to interact with me. It's not about who killed JFK, right? It's about you not wanting to be here now with me in the bedroom, having a conversation, being together. And this is really good to hear this about Samadhi, because we can think, and it's a shadow, it gets misused as a way of like, get me out of here. And there are elements of Samadhi, because we are retreating from sense contact, like that last step, sustained, silent, focused meditation. I mentioned last week that these are adapted from some instructions from a well-known teacher, Ajahn Brahm, a Western Buddhist monk who's the abbot of a monastery near Perth, Australia. But the use of an anchor, right? That the whole point, and we don't stay with the anchor. I mean, as our concentration practice develops, we might use the breath as an anchor, or in the past, a mantra. There's so many different things people have used as a primary meditation object. But when the mind really has gathered and settled, and moment by moment is knowing that meditation object, then internally the mind generates a good feeling, and it represents that good feeling to itself. It's called a nimitta, some of you might know that, or a counterpoint sign. And the mind is basically representing to itself its very settled, gathered nature. And then that actually becomes the positive, wholesome flavor of the concentration, you could say, becomes the meditation object. And there's part of what a meditator has to navigate, someone doing more concentration practice has to navigate, is the transition from the primary meditation object, like the breath, to the effect of the concentration itself as the primary meditation object. The sense of seclusion, the sense of stillness, the sense of light, the sense of being held. There are these qualities that come with concentration that will be slightly different for each of us, but all of them will be pleasant and healing in a kind of deeper sense. And they will evoke greed because of that they're pleasant, and then we'll have to navigate like wanting to own. So how to be interested without indulging, taking them personally, these wholesome qualities. So I'll just mention before we end these four ways the Buddha talks about this concentration, or samatha, samadhi, unification of the mind and heart. And the first thing the Buddha mentions is about the pleasant abiding here and now. This is the one trustworthy thread. Like, if we don't understand this about our whole life, and especially our whole spiritual life, we're kind of doomed. Because one of the things about a human being that is relatively settled is that we're willing to leave behind a pleasure for a more refined, a more beautiful pleasure, right? That's just like a sign of health, mental health, is that, oh yeah, I can let this go because there's this over here. There's a great experiment with children. I don't know, I won't be able to describe it perfectly, but with marshmallows, maybe some of you studied psychology in college remember this. But it's the basic premise is, I forget the age, but maybe they probably have done it with different age groups, but let's say 3-4 years of age. And they put a little marshmallow right there on a plate in front of the child, and they say, You can eat that if you want, but if you just don't eat that, when I come back, you can have 2 marshmallows. But if you eat it, that's fine, but you won't get another one. And then the person in the lab coat leaves the room. And they, of course, are videotaping this poor child. And you see the child sort of going through the whole moral dilemma of like, it's right there, they said I could eat it. But a wise person, can sense how it all works. Oh yeah, it's much better. It's just like about saving money, in some ways. If you have a fortunate situation where you can put aside some, you could spend it, but it might be nice to save it and to be able to buy something that you really want, as opposed to run immediately to the store, and get a bottle of Dr. Pepper. And I'm thinking to myself, when I had my paper route, it's just like you could save it or you could spend it. And the same thing, it's like there's a pleasure in moving your body when you're sitting, or there's a pleasure, and not that much, but there is a pleasure in letting your mind think whatever it wants to think, and going down this pathway and regurgitating this thing over here. But there's an even greater pleasure in refraining from doing those things with your mind. And the thing is, we don't know what that pleasure is until we start to experiment with the training, with the refraining. Is there something of real value? And the way that helps us is to connect with the thread of pleasure. And it's basically we have to switch our whole sense of pleasure from kind of more of an ordinary sense pleasure of having something sweet to the pleasure of, we call in Buddhism seclusion. But it's basically, initially, it's just because even when we're getting, like in a more worldly sense, we're getting a nice experience, having a nice massage or whatever for you is a nice experience, there's still some agitation around it. Wanting more of it, wanting it a little bit more this way or a little bit more that way. And we can't really lock it in. Sense pleasures, we can't really lock it in. But the thing about the pleasure of seclusion, it's more about what's not there than what is there. So it's like there's something onward leading about the pleasure of seclusion. So when this mind or your mind notices the contentedness that isn't about the particular conditions, it's like it's the contentment that arises with not needing things to be other than the way they are. So seclusion is sort of that flavor of the mind being independent. That's why in the way Ajahn Brahm is asking us to train the mind, sustained silent meditation, when we're getting interested in the silence instead of the noise in the present moment, we're getting to know the silence and we're learning to value the silence. And it's kind of what begins to happen in our mind is we notice the difference between what's being known, the different objects that are coming and going and being known, and the knowing, the space, the silent space of knowing. Did you get that sense with that second step? Like you can't really separate the object that's being known, right? You can't separate the object from the knowing of the object. Right? There's no knowing of the object without the object. And there's no object without the knowing of the object. So together they're, in a sense, the same thing. But as our mind gets more subtle, we can keep this aspect of the present moment in mind, the knowing, the silent knowing. Not what's being known, but the silent knowing itself. But like I said in the guided meditation, it's subtle. And subtle is hard to be aware of until that muscle gets developed in the mind. It's like anything, whatever particular skill, people who are really good musicians, you can be aware of sound and tone and pitch and things like that in a way that others of us are oblivious to, because you've trained your mind, the mind has been trained to be sensitive to that. So the first step is to train our mind to be sensitive to that thread of pleasure. It feels good when the mind goes from being pushed around by sense experience, like inundated with sense contact, that sound, that sensation in the body, that thought, that visual experience. It's like every moment there are so many impressions coming in through the 6 ways that we're sensitive: eyes and ears and tongue and nose and skin and thoughts too, right? Thoughts make contact in the sense that there's sensitivity to thought, in the way there's sensitivity to sight and sound and smell and taste and touch. And we're inundated. And every time there's contact, there's an opinion in a sense. We either ignore it because it doesn't seem important, or we like it and we're strategizing, or we don't like it and we're strategizing about getting away from it. But it's agitating. So when we were uncovering the mind independent of conditions, the knowing mind, let's say, there's something about that. And then the next step to sort of strengthen that is like, here, I'll prove to myself, in a sense, I'll prove to myself that I can put down the world by just being interested in this one thing. I don't actively try to put down the world. I try to actively be interested in the meditation object, to the exclusion of everything else. To keep it in mind, to keep it in mind, to keep it in mind. And then we realize the mind that's not sensitive to the enormity of contact, of sense experience, right? Because we're just knowing this. And we've all had little bits of this experience anyway, of being absorbed in something so fully that we are oblivious to everything else, right? This happens. If you're sitting inside of a body of water and you see the flickering on the surface, and the mind momentarily just gets interested in the play of light on the surface of the water because it's kind of an engaging, trippy thing, right? And for a moment, you're not aware of everything else. You're only aware of that. And then you want to build a cabin on the lake because you think the spot, but it isn't the flickering of light. It was the mind having dropped its sense of responsibility to all the other sense contacts. So whenever we have that experience of being relatively unified, we generally go back to it. That's why people like extreme sports, because when they're jumping off, bungee jumping off of a bridge or something like that, whatever it might be, or I saw an ad on TV recently of, it looked like just like a 5-year-old on one of those dirt bikes doing all these sort of tricks. They were advertising Ford pickups, but anyway, it's like the mind gets collected, right? The mind isn't thinking about anything else in those moments. So we gravitate to all sorts of stuff, extreme stuff, whatever it might be. Horror films, sex, things that gather, that even some of you know this, I'm sure, but in, I forget what it is now, but the French term for making love or orgasm, it's like a little death. Anybody know the French phrase for that? Oh, somebody said it. Good. But anyway, it's because it's like when the death is, the mind lets go of everything else. It's gathered. It's interested in one thing. To be fully interested in one thing, it's fully not interested in everything else. And then the mind experiences freedom from that ordinary sense of responsibility to sensuality, to the complexity of sense experience. Well, as a meditator, we can train the mind to do that. And it's very healing, but besides the fact that it's very pleasant and healing, it really sets up insight. And that's what the next 3 steps are. So the first one the Buddha talks about is following this thread of pleasure. And the basic line from the suttas is, it's pleasant abiding here and now. This is good in the beginning, middle, and end. So as soon as you start to move in that direction, like away from distractedness to non-distraction, there is pleasure involved. And it's subtle. But if you learn to follow it, it's a trustworthy guide. And then the next point the Buddha makes, he talks about psychic abilities that come from concentration. But the bigger point here is that it will make you sensitive. Cultivating concentration will make you sensitive. And sensitivity is basically a good thing. It's just hard to bear. It's not easy being a sensitive human being without wisdom, right? And a lot of us, a lot of the time, we feel too sensitive. So we have all kinds of ways to dull our sensitivity, whatever it is. Some of us crawl into bed because we just don't want to feel what we're feeling. Some of us use drug and alcohol. There's any number of ways human beings who tend to be more sensitive. And it's really a matter of wisdom catching up to the sensitivity. So if there's a lot of sensitivity and not much wisdom, then what that means, not much wisdom, what that means is you think the sensitivity is happening to you and that you have to do something about it. And when wisdom comes up, deepens, then wisdom understands that sensitivity is just what it is, something being known. And there's, who knows how true they are, but I would recommend keeping an open mind about how sensitive the mind can be. And so there's lots of stories of people with psychic abilities, and even my own, feeble practice over these many years, I noticed that kind of sensitivity that is unusual, just what the mind is aware of, what the mind knows. And not that the mind understands how it knows that, but it does know some things. And so I would just keep an open mind about it. And there's so many examples of where people get into trouble with that kind of sensitivity because they take it personally, and they want to use it as a power. Even stories in the tradition about the Buddha's evil cousin who had a lot of psychic abilities evidently and wanted to take over the Sangha, the community of monks and nuns, and it was messy. So even the Buddha had that, right? And it's sort of just the way of the world, is to understand that with power comes responsibility. And it's the same thing with the power of samadhi, of concentration. So that's why in practice we emphasize ethical conduct so much, because as we develop the heart and mind, there's a lot of power that goes with that. Clarity, sensitivity, and it can get misused. Just kind of in support of our greed, hatred, and delusion. Basically, the habits of greed, hatred, and delusion. So this thread of pleasure is one of the main points about samadhi. Understanding there will be more sensitivity, and sensitivity is kind of a hard skill to handle when we're sensitive. We can kind of move about in the world feeling pretty raw and open. We just sense so much, right? Because that's the after effect of a settled heart. The way we protect ourselves from being overexposed is we dull ourselves. We do too much, we think too much, concerned about too much, and so we get superficial, so nothing really tends to land. I noticed that even getting the news about the assassination attempt yesterday, and I noticed just that kind of buzz about, and just forgetting that someone lost their life, and there was a family that lost a loved one, and 2 people critically harmed, and what must be going on for them and their families. You just the kind of really connecting with, oh yeah, this is all the way it is. Instead of, well, what's the effect on the election, or whatever the buzz in our mind might be about. And then the last two I've talked about, so we have the thread of pleasure, the deepening of sensitivity, and I'll just mention briefly. Then the third one is really about that stability that comes from sensitivity really allows wisdom to read cause and effect. So the mind can comprehend. It's related to sensitivity, but in a sense, it's putting sensitivity to work. We use the sensitivity, the subtlety, to see the lawfulness or the conditionality, we call it. But basically, it's cause and effect. We have some attitude in our mind. How did this attitude arise? Well, with Samadhi, with that stability of present moment awareness, continuity of present moment awareness, there's a real clear sense of the lawfulness of the attitude that's arisen and how it's right now getting supported. And without that supports, how that attitude would cease and another attitude would come to mind. It all, like the lawfulness, just starts to come out. So that both in terms of like you and your partner are going through one of those dances you go through, whether it's a wholesome one or an unwholesome one, arguing with each other, but with a lot of that calm, stable samadhi, then even as it's happening, wisdom can read the lawfulness of it. Of course, there was this, and because of this, there's that. It's complex. I'm not saying it's just simplistic, but it's just everything looks lawful because it is, but we tend not to see it because we're superficial. And that's what just starts to stand out. And then the fourth, so the third is seeing that lawfulness, like comprehending cause and effect. And then the fourth is that unwholesome habits get uprooted. And I mentioned this earlier about that purity of the heart and mind. It's like when you have a really clean cloth, you notice what's the dirt on the clean cloth. And when the energetically the heart is really stable, then we'll notice the reverberations of hate, the reverberations of greed, the reverberations of distractedness, even when it's really subtle. It will just stand out. There's that. There's that. And it's like in the wisdom seeing that there's the letting go of that. The cause for me not to get involved in some unwholesome thinking, for example, or unwholesome speech, is the recognition of its unwholesomeness. Restraint doesn't come from me stopping me from being bad. Restraint, like in the Buddhist system, all action has to be understood as a natural process, not somebody doing something. Right? So we see how that letting go of what's unskillful happens naturally, and how it actually, in the deepest sense, gets uprooted. That's actually the definition of an awakened being, is somebody who has uprooted. It's not somebody who's in that moment skillful. They might have an awakened moment where there's just a lot of love and clarity and skillfulness. But a fully awakened person is someone who not only has moments of real clarity and real skill, but they've also done the work of uprooting the tendencies to greed, hatred, and delusion, so that no matter what arose for them, it wouldn't trigger greed, hatred, and delusion, because they've uprooted the tendency. And that takes a lot of that stability and sensitivity to those latent habits, to take things personally, those latent habits to trust in greed and trust in hate in all of its forms. But we should leave it here. I'm a couple minutes over.